needs. In an ideal society, all people are not equal. Plato says a good society must be built on the truth, and the truth is that all people are not equal. A good society is not a place where there's equality, but a place where each person knows what his role or her role is and performs it well. The role of these people is to rule, these people is to protect, these people is to work in an ideal society. Now, bit of a digression here. Think about what this means for democracy. What do you think Plato would say about democracy? Well, probably can guess. He says democracy is a bad idea. Because in a democracy, we're giving these people the same say as these people. And unfortunately, there are more of these people in the world than there are these people. In fact, we can talk about this as a hierarchy in a couple of different ways. One is, we often represent hierarchies with pyramids. So we have a pyramid. The rational people in an ideal society would be at the top. The competitive people would be at the bottom. The spiritual people would be in the middle. And that represents the amount of power they would have in society and the amount of status that they would probably have in society. It also probably represents the number that there are in a society. For example, a relatively small number of rational people, a larger number of spiritual people, and the largest number of people are repetitive. So, and here's the problem with democracy. In a democracy, where you make everybody equal, you're essentially turning the power over to these people because there are more of them. They have more votes. And so, how will they do what's best for the society? No, Plato says they will do what will gratify their own appetites. What will serve their appetites best, not what's good for everybody, what's good for society. And so democracy is a fundamentally bad idea. Now, think about this. Imagine you want a trip to Paris, France, not Paris, Kentucky. And so you go to Cincinnati and you go through customs and you go get on a plane and you're going to fly to Paris. You're sitting there on the plane. The person sitting next to you gets up, walks up to the front of the plane where there's a microphone and says, "Hi, I'd like to announce my candidacy for pilot. I do have a pilot's license. I have 500 hours flying time in a Cessna 150. I believe in strong defense and families and all those kinds of things. Truth, justice, and the American way. Please vote for me." So, what are you going to do? Well, you might say, well, I'm going to wait and see who else is running. I see if there's somebody who's more qualified to fly this plane. But if you're me, I'm just going to get off the plane. See, I don't want to be on any plane flown democratically. I want the power to be given to the people who know how to fly the plane and let them fly the plane. And I'm not going to complain that it's not democratic. I'm not going to complain that that I don't get a say. I don't want a say. As long as I get to Paris safely, I don't care if I have no say about how we do it. I don't want to be sitting on a plane and flying, over the Atlantic and have the pilot come on and say the chair would entertain a motion about how high we should fly or how fast we should land. I don't know. I don't have the expertise for those things. I want to turn it over to somebody who knows. Now, Plato didn't know about transatlantic jets, but he did know about ships sailing the Mediterranean. And he says you would not want to sail the Mediterranean on a ship sailed democratically. What we want is to give the authority to the captain and let the captain sail the ship. As long as it gets us where we want to go, we don't care that we have no say. He says democracy would be a terrible way to sail a ship, and it's a terrible way to run a government. Why? Because democracy allows the appetitive to have just as much say as the rational. And that, he says, is a bad idea. So we have this big challenge now. If we're going to have a good society, we've got to figure out who the people are who should be ruling, who the people who should vote, who should have the say at the top. How do you figure that out? Well, Plato says that often people are like their parents, so that rational parents often have rational kids. And appetitive parents often have appetitive kids. And so if you just base it on parentage, you might get pretty close. But that's not close enough. He says, because sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes you do have rational parents who have very appetitive kids. Sometimes you have very appetitive parents who have spirited or rational kids. So really, to do this thing right, we have to start off every generation as equals. and try to figure out who is who among them. Now, he says in an ideal society, we would have a large, complex institution, one of whose primary purposes would be to sort people into these social classes, to identify who goes where. And that institution he called public education. Now, that may sound odd to you that he proposes this institution. Now, one thing that's odd to us is that we think of public education as a given, but there was no such thing as public education in the ancient world. And so Plato was very radical in his thinking about this, proposing that government would provide education for everybody. It's a very, very radical idea in the ancient world. And of course, it didn't catch on. He proposed this, in the 5th century, 4th century BC, but it doesn't actually happen in our civilization until, on any large scale, until the 1500s, 1600s, and really even after that, much later than that. So this is a radical proposal. But one of the purposes of schools, he says, is to sort people into social classes. Now, that might violate our basic sense of what schools are about. We usually talk about schools as places in a democratic society that provide social mobility, that allow kids to move up the ladder. They don't sort, they just give opportunities. He says, well, democracy is a bad idea. Schools should sort. Now, again, there's an irony here because we say you shouldn't sort because we believe in democracy. But do we sort in public schools? There's quite a bit of sociological evidence that suggests that we do. That schools don't always give opportunities. They tend to sort people, into social classes. A number of years ago, there was a sociologist who was studying socioeconomic status. And he was looking at what are the best predictors of what a person's socioeconomic status will be as an adult. And he discovered that one of the best predictors is whether or not you go to college. If you go to college, you're probably going to move up the ladder. If you don't, you may not. So then he got to ask him, what's the best predictor of whether or not you're going to go to college? So he discovered it was whether or not you were in a college preparatory track in high school. If you were in vocational track, you probably weren't going to college. If you were in a academic pre-college track, you probably did. That was a pretty good predictor of how you're going to end up. And they got to asking, what's the best predictor of which track you'll be in high school? And he discovered that it had to do with typically recommendations of a school counselor when you were in about 8th grade. So what's the best predictor of that? Well, your grades earlier in middle school. So what's the best predictor of how you're going to do in middle school? Well, how well you did in the upper grades of elementary school. What's the best predictor of how you're going to do in upper grades of elementary school? Eventually, he discovered that the reading group that you were in first grade was a pretty good predictor of all those things that followed after. A pretty good predictor ultimately of what socioeconomic status you would achieve as an adult. Now, I don't know, that strikes me as quite terrifying, actually. That first grade teachers in teaching reading, they think they're dividing kids into groups so that they can more effectively teach them according to their developmental needs in reading. And in fact, they may be destining them to a particular social class as an adult. Isn't that scary? Especially in a society where we say schools are supposed to provide social mobility that allows you to move up the ladder. Now, think about that a bit, those of you, especially those of you who are interested in elementary education. But let me say you're off the hook a bit here, because you get to asking what's the best predictor of what your reading group will be in first grade, and discovered that the best predictor of that was your parents' socioeconomic status. And so the good news is it's not that kindergarten or first grade teachers are assigning us to our adult social status, but rather the system tends to perpetuate whatever the social status already is. So kids from lower income homes end up being in the low reading group, and it carries itself all the way through. Kids from high income homes tend to be in the upper reading groups, and it carries all the way through. Now notice I've used the word tend to. These are statistical probabilities, not certainties. But again, even if that lets the elementary teachers off the hook a bit, it doesn't really solve the problem, because in education we were supposed to be providing, at least in America, supposed to be providing social mobility. And what Parsons' research suggests is that we don't actually provide much mobility. We tend to just perpetuate existing socioeconomic arrangements. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to think about there, and I hope that this little example will provoke you to think over the next few days and weeks about the relationship between school and socioeconomic status of kids when they grow up.